Hello everybody, my name is Coen Brummer and I'm the director of the Meester Hans van Mierlo Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture with the American historian and New York Times best-selling author, Mr. Thomas Frank. After the parliamentary elections last March, the Netherlands woke up with a new political balance of power. The VVD conservatives and D66 liberals won, the left lost, and a so-called right-wing populist bloc of Wilders, Baudet, Ja21, and perhaps we should also count in the Farmers' Party as well, took 20% of the vote, more than ever before. And it is tempting to concentrate on the growth of these right-wingers. After all, they are the fiercest opponents of the consensus politics of the political center. But more is shifting. Parties that demand alternatives to the status quo did quite well. Newcomers like Bijeen or Volt entered the parliament, the Animal Party gained seats, and Pieter Omtzigt, a parliamentarian that came to embody the desire for a more just bureaucratic government and almost single-handedly brought down the previous cabinet, received nearly as many votes as his party leader Hoekstra. It reminds us a bit about the situation in the United States not so long ago. While a Washington machinery insider, President Biden, won the elections, anti-establishment candidate Bernie Sanders was immensely popular, and while Trump lost, his political legacy manifests itself in various forms every day. Now, it seems safe to say that the political times we live in cannot be described by a simple rise of the right-wing populist narrative, or a so-called battle between ignorant populist politicians on the one side and reasonable anti-populists on the other side. And that is why I am very pleased that Mr. Thomas Frank is with us today from Washington, D.C. Mr. Frank is the author of a thought-provoking book called The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. And in it, he addresses important questions, like, is populism the accurate term to describe some of these anti-establishment platforms we see in politics today? What gave rise to these political movements that are opposing the political center consensus of the last decades? Are we as liberals ourselves to blame, perhaps? And what can a liberal political party do about it anyway? I look forward to his lecture in which he will address these questions. But before I give the floor to Mr. Frank, I have a few practical requests for everybody in our digital audience. Please mute your microphone if you are with us in Zoom. And if you like, you can keep your camera on, of course. And if you have any questions during the lecture, you can already post them in the Zoom chat or in the YouTube live stream. If you're in the Zoom chat, I will call your name and you can unmute yourself after the lecture and ask the question to Mr. Frank yourselves. And if you're on YouTube, someone will send me a text message with your question and I will pose it for you. That being said, without further ado, I'm happy to give the floor to Mr. Thomas Frank.
Okay. Hey, how about that? Well, how are you all doing? This is so wonderful to be with you from here in Washington, D.C., talking to all you people in the Netherlands. And I want to thank you for inviting me. This is very kind of you, very thoughtful. And also, I want to thank you for listening to me as I speak only in English. I am so sorry that I don't speak Dutch because, well, I'm sorry for many reasons, but I am also very thankful that so many people in the Netherlands can understand English. So I'm going to talk about my new book, The People Know, and I'm going to talk about what we mean by populism here in America. And I'm going to try to speak slowly so that I can be understood. And Coen, if I go too fast, would you please let me know? And I'm going to try to do illustrations with this presentation as well. This is going to be a new one. I've never done this before, so let's give it a try. All right. Just a few short years ago, we Americans knew what we were doing in the world. We were going to make this planet into one big likeness of ourselves. We had the experts. We knew how it was done. Our policy operatives would de-radicalize here and regime change there. Our economists would float billions to the good guys and slap sanctions on the bad. And pretty soon the whole world was going to be stately and neat, safe for debt instruments and empowerment seminars, for hors d'oeuvres in the embassy garden and taxis that you hailed with a smartphone. Democracy. Of thee we sang. Now we stand chastened, humiliated, bewildered. Democracy. We tremble to think of what it might do next. Or so, anyways, goes the wail of the American leadership class as they endure another year of panic over where our system is dragging them. The people, they say, are out of control. Populism is the word that comes to the lips of the respectable and the highly educated when they see the global system going haywire, as it has done for the last 5 years. Populism, for them, is a one-word evocation of the logic of the mob. Populism is the people as a great rampaging beast. And what has happened over the last 5 years, the thinkers of the Washington Beltway tell us, is that the common folk have declared independence from experts and along the way from reality itself. And so they, the learned, have come together to rescue civilization. Political scientists, policy advisors, journalists, technologists, CEOs, joining as one to save our social order, to save it from populism. This imaginary struggle of expert versus populist has a fundamental, almost a biblical flavor to it. It's a battle of order against chaos, education against ignorance, mind against appetite, enlightenment against bigotry, culture against barbarism. And from TED Talk and red carpet, the call rings forth. Democracy must be controlled before it ruins our democratic way of life. Yes, they admit ordinary people are upset. Everyone knows this. But the ones whose well-being must concern us most are the elites whom the people threaten to topple. So if the common people have lost faith in the ones in charge, it can only be because something has gone wrong with the people themselves. As a writer for The Atlantic magazine put it in the summer of 2016, our most pressing political problem today is that the country abandoned the establishment, not the other way around. An article in Foreign Policy magazine in that same year expressed it slightly more archly. It's time for the elites to rise up against the ignorant masses. What is populism really? Well, once upon a time, populism was a label that people in America applied to themselves. It wasn't a made-up political science concept. The word was a proper noun. It was spelled with a capital P, and it was an American invention. In fact, the word was invented a few miles from where I grew up in Kansas City, in the state of Kansas, in the year 1891. And the group that the word referred to, the Populist Party, was one of America's great economic political uprisings. It was a gigantic mass movement, mainly of farmers, but it was a movement in which millions of ordinary Americans learned to think that the country's economic system was something that they could change by common effort. Now, populism's biggest innovation back in the 1890s was to make a political appeal based on class solidarity. This was a new thing at the time. And they tried to bring together farmers in the South and the West with factory workers in the cities of the North. The interests of rural and civic labor are the same, the populists proclaimed in their famous manifesto. Their enemies are identical. And by enemies, what they meant was those who prospered while making nothing. In other words, bankers, railroad barons, monopolists, and commodity traders, along with corrupt politicians who served wealth instead of the people. And believe me, there was a lot of that sort of thing in the 1890s. Now, the Populist Party enjoyed great success at first, and they elected governors. We had 2 populist governors in my home state of Kansas. They elected US senators, there were mayors of cities, but the whole party died out within a decade. It was done within 10 years. It was our abortive attempt to start a kind of labor party here in the United States, and it didn't work out. But the philosophy that the Populist Party embodied did not die. Most of the Populist Party's big ideas were eventually enacted into law. We got farm programs, we reformed the currency here in America, we got railroad regulation, and women got the right to vote. These were all ideas associated with populism. And the populist idea of ordinary people coming together against economic privilege lives on to this day. You might say it constitutes one of the main streams of our democratic tradition here in America. And in my new book, I try to trace the development of this idea over the decades. For example, you see a very strong populist streak in the culture and politics of the 1930s, when America was, when our president was Franklin Roosevelt. You see populism again in the civil rights era of the 1960s. Anyhow, that is the historic meaning of the word populism. And when we use it today as a handy term for demagogues and racists and would-be dictators, we are turning that historical definition upside down. Populism in its original meaning was a profoundly democratic movement. It was a movement that by the standards of its time was anti-demagogue. It was pro-enlightenment. It was pro-science. It was pro-equality. In its heyday, and alone among the American political parties of the 1890s, populism was the group that stood for human rights. Populism was the only party of the day that had strong, or I should say prominent, female leaders. Populism was the party that defied the poisonous idea of white solidarity. And we can talk about that later if you want to know the details. It's actually a fascinating story. Now, that's what populism was. Now, and of course, scholars and pundits and journalists, they have a right to ignore all that and to divorce any word they choose from its original meaning. That is perfectly legal. You can redefine populist however you please. But ask yourself this: why would someone do that? Why would you take such a fine democratic word and flip it to mean racist, to mean dictator, to mean anti-intellectual? Why do that? And the answer to that question is that denunciations of populism, like the ones we hear all around us nowadays, are part of a long tradition of pessimism about popular sovereignty and democratic participation. The name I give to that tradition, that pessimistic tradition, is anti-populism. And tracing the history of anti-populism is the other half of this new book that I've written. And what you find when you dig into the history of anti-populism, and it's absolutely fascinating, but what you find is that it is a habit of mind that expresses itself in the same way over and over again as the years pass, from the 1890s right down to the present day. So what is anti-populism? This part of the story also begins in the 1890s. America went into a Great Depression in the 1890s. Economic discontent was everywhere. We had these enormous strikes, probably the biggest strikes ever seen in the United States. There was a march of unemployed people on Washington, first time that ever happened. And respectable Americans basically concluded that the class war was at hand. And then in the summer of 1896, something absolutely crazy happened. The Democratic Party, which is one of our two traditional parties, the Democratic Party meets for its convention. They turn against the sitting Democratic president. They declare their opposition to the gold standard, which was our way of organizing the currency at the time. And they nominate for the president a man named William Jennings Bryan. He is a 36-year-old congressman from the state of Nebraska who has this amazing power of oratory. He's an amazing public speaker. And this guy, Bryan, he talks like a populist. He is with the populists on this one big issue of the gold standard. And the populists meet for their convention. Remember, the Populist Party is still going at the time. They're a big deal. And so they meet for their convention and they endorse him also. So it looks like Bryan is this very young candidate who has this extraordinary ability. It looks like this guy is going to be elected president. He seems like a man of destiny. He has everything going for him. But these two events, him being nominated by the Democrats and then by the populists, trigger absolute hysteria among America's ruling class. To the establishment of this country, there was no doubt about what William Jennings Bryan signified. One of America's main political parties had been captured by radicalism. And the shock was as great as a stock market crash. Now, what I am about to describe was an insane overreaction, but as we all know, that happens. That happens in politics from time to time. And so here comes anti-populism in 1,000 expressions of highbrow contempt for ordinary Americans. Society's worst elements, the establishment came to believe, were lining up against its best. And the people who thought of themselves as the best came together to suppress the challenge of Bryan. Journalists, scholars, university professors, society preachers, millionaires, bankers, businessmen of every description, they all came together with the Republican Party to crush the threat posed by Bryan. And the word that they used to summarize their hatred and their fear for the Democrat was the same word we use today, populism. I'm going to try to show you some images from this famous campaign of 1896, and I'll talk about them while we put them up. This is, can y'all see that? Martin, can you see that? This is a political cartoon from a New York humor magazine showing what the country faced in the year 1896. You can see there's the figure of populism wearing a French Revolution anarchy cap, wielding a torch called ruin and a knife called murder. And he's got capital on the run. And you probably can't read what the capital, these are bankers and respectable people on the right-hand side of the screen. But the populist figure represents everything that is disreputable and awful. You know, this is the lower classes, people who have no business being in politics, rising up against their betters. So what the reactionaries said in the 1890s is that populism is mob rule. Populism is a form of ignorance. Let's see if I can move on to the next image. This is a little tricky for me. Well, darn it. Here we go. This is William McKinley is the Republican candidate. He's depicted on the left, and he's walking through what's called Populist Alley, where these lower class citizens are glaring at him. And but don't worry, the police are here to protect him. as police do. This is William Jennings Bryan depicted as a murderer. He's wearing a sash marked anarchy. He's actually depicted as an Italian immigrant, and he has murdered Lady Liberty on the steps of the US Treasury. Here's William Jennings Bryan depicted as Satan. It's astonishing, isn't it? This one's particularly good. Here's William Jennings Bryan in the middle with flying the red flag of repudiation. These three figures in front of him are riot, repudiation, and populism. And they are, of course, rioting. But don't worry, the police are closing in on them because that's what police do. Police suppress radicals like populists. Here's William Jennings Bryan traveling around the country, which he actually did. He traveled around the country in a railroad train giving speeches. But if you look at the words of the speeches, that this is all made up. This is not really what he said, but he's saluting the wisdom of the common man. He's telling ordinary people that they are smart enough to govern. And you can see the ordinary people, those are populists, the farmers that are depicted on the left, and they're supposed to look like fools. That's how the press of the day would depict a rural imbecile. Here's Bryan depicted as a satanic creature from hell, basically. It's kind of amazing. And that's enough. We can talk about the rest of it some of the time. But that's what the campaign of 1896 was like. And the idea is very simple. Populism is ignorance. Populism is a willful refusal to listen to experts. Populism is irrational. Populism is the triumph of passion over reason. Populism is also a form of mental illness. But above all, what populism is, as you could see from those images, populism is insolence. Populism is an uprising by low-ranking people who have no business being in government. Populism, the American establishment said, is the world turned upside down, with the intelligent and the capable cast down and the foolish on top. Now, this was a stereotype, folks. This had nothing to do with what populism actually was. This stereotype that I just described came out of a climate of hysteria. It was designed to be cruel and insulting and to flatter the rich and the highborn while frightening them about class war. You know, the populace marching down that street in New York City they're going to attack the banks, carrying William Jennings Bryan on their shoulders. It's ridiculous. But even so, this stereotype lived on. And it cropped up again and again over the decades here in the United States. Indeed, every element of that stereotype should be familiar to you because those are still the things that we say about populism today. So now you're wondering, how was this idea transmitted down to us? How did this go from being a pet stereotype of scornful, wealthy American reactionaries in the 1890s to being what it is today, the common sense of the liberal foundation world? How did that happen? Well, the fascinating twist in this story comes in the 1950s, the days of what we called in America the liberal consensus. That word is important, the consensus. And these were years of great prosperity here in the United States. And there was a new elite rising up in America in those days, a professional elite who derived their power from educational credentials by going to fancy schools and doing very well, going to graduate schools, getting PhDs. And the great faith of this elite was that mankind had reached what they called the end of ideology. Is this familiar to you? Or do you know this idea, the end of ideology? This is a sort of populist figure here on the cover. And in the 1950s, we have passed that sort of thing by. Thanks to modern scholarship and modern managerial methods, they said, the big questions had all been solved by America. We in America, we knew how to run an economy. We knew how to market a refrigerator or a Cadillac car. We knew how to contain communism. But beneath the surface, the gentlemen of the consensus believed, there lurked these scary forces, these mass movements of working class people who were given to irrational grievances and terrible passions. Now, it didn't really matter to the consensus thinkers whether these movements were on the left or on the right. That wasn't important. They were all the same, and they were all extremely dangerous. The proximate example, the thing that really scared them, was called McCarthyism. We can talk about that some other time. But the example, the movement that the consensus scholars settled upon as they constructed their theory of democracy's dangers was, you guessed it, the original populist movement back in the 1890s. And they took the name of this movement, populism, and they made it into a generic noun with a lowercase p, a generic noun for the unreasoning folly of mass democracy. So what I'm saying is that populism became their word for the opposite of themselves. It was the ism that they used to describe demagoguery and intolerance and the crazy passions of the mob. And populism once again became what it had been for the reactionaries of the 1890s. It was the same thing that we just saw in those cartoons. It's anarchy, it's insolence, it's democracy gone mad. Populism was egalitarianism taken to such an extreme that it rejected even legitimate hierarchies. And what's a legitimate hierarchy, you might ask? Of course, that's a hierarchy. That's the hierarchy that the intellectuals of the 1950s had themselves climbed, the hierarchy of scholarly achievement. So populism supposedly was the denial of expertise. Now, why did the gentlemen of the consensus era think this? Why did they settle on this movement of the 1890s as their arch enemy? Why? Because of a massively influential work of history published in 1955 called The Age of Reform. This is a very important book in those days, massive bestseller, won the Pulitzer Prize, hugely significant. It's a landmark in American thought, written by a man called Richard Hofstadter, the greatest historian of the 1950s. And in this book, Hofstadter reevaluated American liberalism and declared that the populist movement, which most people thought of at the time as, that was the beginning of the liberal movement in America, he said, no, populism had actually been irrational. It was anti-Semitic, he said. It was backward-looking. It was xenophobic. It was anti-intellectual, it was conspiracy-minded, and all of these things, because the rank and file of populism suffered from what Hofstadter called status anxiety. Now then, other leading scholars of the 1950s immediately piled on, describing populism as a hatred of learning and sophistication and refinement in general. And so basically, it's that same old anti-populist stereotype that we saw from the 1890s, but jazzed up with modern day psychological jargon. And so denouncing populism, one of the great themes of the 1950s, and everybody agreed on it. Mass movements of working class people were very dangerous. And then a really funny thing happened, folks. Within 10 years, a little bit more than that, a dozen, Richard Hofstadter's theory of populism was crushingly refuted by other historians. They proved convincingly that Hofstadter was completely wrong about the populist party. It wasn't any of those things that he said. It wasn't irrational. It wasn't anti-intellectual. It wasn't xenophobic. It wasn't anti-Semitic, at least not by the standards of its time. So I used to study history. This was my subject. And in the world of professional history, this is a very famous episode, this famous beatdown where Richard Hofstadter was proven wrong in this very humiliating way. But here's the punchline of this joke. None of that matters. Right-thinking people everywhere in the world continue to use Hofstadter's wrong understanding of populism as though that scholarly beatdown never happened. In fact, today there is an entire pedagogy based on Hofstadter's wrong redefinition of the word populism, which is a pedagogy that is based on a famous mistake from the 1950s. Now, why does this go on? How can you build an entire structure of thought based on a mistake? The answer is easy, because it is flattering to elites. Whether our elite is one of inherited wealth or industrial monopoly or academic achievement, it is automatically drawn to anti-populism, to this belief that, I'm going to quote from a famous sociologist here, this belief that if only responsible elites could be left alone, if only political issues could be kept from the people, the elites would make wise decisions. And so on we go, repeating the same eternal stereotype, the bigotry of ordinary people, the folly of protest movements, and the wisdom of elites. Now, there's one, I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and I'm grateful, but there's one last episode to consider, one last eruption. And I just want to say a quick aside. I was born in 1965. And since the 1980s, inequality has only grown worse and worse and worse in the United States, with the result that we have now basically returned to the kind of economy that the populists, the original populists, faced back in the 1890s. And yet, by the year 2016, our left party here in America had chosen to accept this. It had become a great friend of the banks and of Silicon Valley. Our left party in America accepted trade agreements that destroyed much of the industry of America. They regarded as their main constituent group the nation's highly educated professional managerial class. And its leader in 2016, the accomplished professional Hillary Clinton, faced off against this bigoted blowhard Donald Trump. And I'm not joking when I say that's what he is. He is a bigoted blowhard. And he did make this great display of pretending to care about the problems of working class people. And then, to the great surprise of everyone, this fool, Trump, managed to win. It was the shock of a lifetime. It's up there with a stock market crash. And the instant and automatic reaction among liberals was to not just revile Trump himself, but to denounce ordinary Americans who had voted for him. And once again, you saw the same thing happen. Upper America came together in airtight unanimity against the lower orders, the people they called populists. And a new species of left practice was born. And where older forms of left politics were optimistic about ordinary Americans, this new variety of liberalism that I'm describing regards them with suspicion and disgust. It dreams not of organizing humanity, but of policing humanity. It's a geyser of moral rebuke erupting against teenagers who've committed some act of cultural appropriation, against Hollywood actors who play an inappropriate role, against public speech by someone with unpopular views, against the wrongful dumping of household trash, against inappropriate tree pruning techniques we spotted in a nearby suburb. The characteristic goal of this form of liberalism is not to get banks and monopolies under control, but to set up a nonprofit, attract funding from banks and monopolies, and then scold the world for its political sins. The white-collar, affluent, highly educated class in America today lives in a utopia of scolding, in which the rich are not just wealthier than you, they're better people than you. Now, here's the message I want to conclude with. For a party of the left, this cannot be the way forward. Folks, to look out over a country like mine, in which the wealth of billionaires increased by $1 trillion during the course of this pandemic, in which monopolies, the Silicon Valley monopolies, have undreamed of power, in which medical bankruptcy is commonplace. It happens all the time. And the university that I went to back in the 1990s today costs $80,000 a year to attend. To look out over all of these things and to declare war on ordinary people because of their wicked souls. Folks, this is madness. I urge you, instead of denouncing the populist tradition, take a look at what it really and truly means, because in my opinion, it is the only chance we have of undoing the long right turn that we've all been on all these many years. Thank you very much, folks.
Thomas, thank you very much for that lecture. I think it was inspiring. I think it was thought-provoking, and I'm sure we all really liked looking at the 19th century and early 20th century cartoons. I see you have one in your study as well, framed.
Yes, this is it. I bought the. It turns out you can buy these old magazines on eBay, and so I bought this one, and I've got it right here. The image of populism terrifying capital.
Wow. We'll go to the audience in a bit, because we already have some interesting questions for you coming in through the Zoom chat and the YouTube live stream. But just to start it off, because you ended in 2016, right, with Hillary versus the Donald, and how it was no surprise that average Americans were persuaded to vote for Trump instead of Clinton. How do you, just a quick response, but how do you look at the start of the Biden administration? Because it's something of perhaps an odd situation in which on the one hand, Biden is like the third Obama term. If you look at the people he's put on high positions, and perhaps part of the policy he's implementing. But on the other hand, you have now these New York Times articles about will Biden be the next Roosevelt with a true democratic socio-economic agenda? How do you look at that?
Well, wouldn't that be wonderful? When I think of that, I often remember they said the same thing about Barack Obama, of course, in 2008, because we were in a Roosevelt situation. The global financial crisis had happened, and here comes Barack Obama. He seemed like the perfect man for the situation. And I remember, I think it was Time magazine put Obama's face in a famous photograph of Roosevelt, where he's driving his car and smoking a cigarette, and it didn't work out that way. So look, I'm hopeful about Joe Biden. I did not support Joe Biden, as you might imagine. I supported Bernie Sanders in the primaries, but I'm hopeful for Joe Biden. The stimulus package that he got passed was really amazing. Some of the things that he's said are inspiring. But it's far too early to tell. The reason I was suspicious of Biden was because he has from my perspective, from my point of view, he has a very bad track record in he was a United States senator for many years, for 40 years or so. I mean, a very long time, from 1972 up until he was vice president. And he was responsible for all sorts of terrible things. I don't know if your audience knows this, but in America, people get sentenced to prison for very long periods for using drugs. This happens all the time. And Biden is largely responsible for that. He also has made it very difficult for people to declare bankruptcy in America, which he did at the behest of the credit card companies. So he has a lot to answer for. But if he becomes a different man as president, I'll be the first one to say, to cheer for him, right? I hope it happens, but it's too early to tell.
All right. And as you know, because you mentioned that you've been reading a lot of Roosevelt biographies, Roosevelt changed his mind as well.
That's right. Many times. Yes, he did.
So perhaps.
That's right.
Interesting. Let's go to some questions of the audience. If I say your name, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Because we are with more than 100 people in this Zoom call, I would like to stress that questions typically contain 2 to 3 sentences and end with a question mark, so we can do a lot of questions in the time we have. I would like to start with Leon Arts, who has a question about the title of your book. Leon, can you unmute yourself?
Well, maybe I can guess what it is. He's wondering, is it a reference to Carl Sandburg? And the answer is yes, it is. Hold on just a second. Do you see?
It's not the question.
It's not the question.
No, but as if Leon isn't with us anymore, then I'll ask the question for him.
Okay.
And that's if you mean with the people know. If you also meant the people know, like
Yes.
knowledge.
KNOW. No, that's not. That's not. It was a reference to. So this is a book-length poem, you see, by Carl Sandburg.
Right. Yes.
Yes. I think we have Leon in our.
Yes, of course. That was my question. Yes, it was because the way you pronounced the title of your book as "The People Know." So I thought about.
It's good. I like that. I like that interpretation. But no, it's a reference to this book from the 1930s, and I don't know about the Netherlands, but in America in the 1930s, this was the great era of the common man. And Carl Sandburg they used to call him the people's poet. And he wrote this book-length poem celebrating ordinary Americans, how they talked, how they worked, things they said. It's wonderful, but it's often regarded as the sort of essential expression of 1930s style populism. But other expressions, if you're familiar with the Hollywood filmmaker Frank Capra, who made Meet John Doe and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And he made all of these movies in the 1930s celebrating ordinary people. And so there was a whole climate of that in the 1930s, and it's dear to my heart. So that's why I took that title.
All right, great. We have another question. This one is by, Roland van Loenen about Michael Sandel. Roland, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Well, hello everybody. Hello special to Mr. Thomas Frank. Yes, recently I read this book of Michael Sandel, and I was really shocked about his analyze. So I was wondering, I also saw you in a short documentary, also commenting on this kind of analysis of him. What is your idea about it?
I actually have not read that book yet. I'm sorry to say. It could be that he has a similar argument to. So in my last book was called Listen Liberal, and it's about how our Democratic Party in America went from being a party that cared about where the number one group that it cared about was working class people, to being a party where its number one group was professional elites, people with advanced degrees and so on. And it could be that, but I have not read his book yet. Okay. I'm sorry to say.
No problem. So then it is difficult to have comment on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Great. There's also a question from more of a historical question by Thomas van Kuipers on the reverse of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party throughout the years.
Interesting. Okay.
Thomas, can you unmute yourself?
We're having trouble with the mute buttons today.
I think people are surprised that I mentioned their name and then they start looking for the mute button. Thomas, are you still in the call?
Well, why don't you just ask? Why don't
I'll
you tell me
ask
what
the question
was?
for him again. He says the 180-degree turn in 1896 wasn't colliding with reverse of Democratic Party being more right than the Republican Party, as it used to, the Republicans were more left. So you already...
Yes, no, that's a good question.
Written down, but yeah.
And that happens, that is largely correct, yes. Although it's American politics are very complicated, but this has happened more than once. So Franklin Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan was a figure of the left, but then after, he sort of, after he and his generation were gone, the Democratic Party moved back to the right, and then they moved to the left again with Franklin Roosevelt. So there was no set definition at the time that one of the parties was the right and one was the left. Each of the two parties in America had a left wing and a right wing. The populists were the first one that was a sort of an identifiable, they were like the Labour Party in the UK. They were the first ones that were identifiably a party of the left. But it wasn't until the 1930s that the Democrats identified themselves as and they don't use the word left in America. They use the word liberal. They identified themselves as a liberal party, and they gathered. So there used to be liberal Republicans, and the liberal Republicans all basically came over and joined the Democratic Party, and the conservative Democrats went over to the Republicans. It took years, but that happened. And just a funny little coda to that story. One of the arguments that people are making now, I don't know if I agree with this, but people are saying that it's going the other direction now. I don't know about that, but people are saying that it's happening again.
All right. Michiel Verkoelen has a question for you as well. Michiel.
And I see that Michael Passerini is raising his hand. Do you see what I'm?
Michiel?
We're not getting any.
Oh,
of these.
sorry. Michiel Verkoelen is on YouTube, so he can't ask a question.
Okay, well,
I'll do it for him.
Okay.
His question is interesting as well. Aren't populist parties and populist commentators not also scolding liberals all the time? It seems to be their main platform.
You mean like Trump? Is
yeah,
that what,
Trump, his supporters.
Oh, absolutely, of course. He's a yeah, but it depends on who. Trump scolds everybody. Trump calls people names. Trump is kind of a bastard. You know what I mean? He's a jerk. He's an unpleasant person. But one of the things in politics that American politicians, and I'm sure Dutch politicians know this as well, is you don't attack ordinary voters because you have to try to persuade them over to your side. There's a famous joke from the 1960s. There was a comedian in the 1960s who ran for office in California. He ran for office as a joke, and then he lost, and he went on TV. He went on TV and they said, well, you lost. Now what do you have to say? And he said, the people have spoken, the bastards. Referring to the people. And it was a joke. But what's funny is now people say things like that all the time, and it's not a joke. They mean it. And it's politicians and people in, pundits who say this now, and they tend to be more closely associated with liberalism than with conservatism. And the sort of classic example of this is Hillary Clinton's sort of epic blunder in 2016 when she referred to Trump supporters as deplorables, and then this other word that she used, irredeemables, which is kind of a religious term meaning that they can't be saved, that they're beyond salvation. And this was she knew right away that this was a mistake, and she tried to walk it back and tried to get out of it. But what's interesting about that election and that the climate of that year is that her supporters said, no, that was not a mistake at all. These people really are deplorable and irredeemable. And I just saw a poll the other day. Now, this is the first time I've ever seen this in a national poll. They asked the two, conservatives what their main issues were, and they asked liberals what their main concerns were. And I forget what the conservative concerns were. You can guess. They're worried about whatever it is. The either the number one or number two liberal concern was Trump's supporters. voters for the other side. They're absolutely, really, really worried about these people, about rank and file, their fellow, ordinary Americans who vote for Republicans, which is, this is new. This is, well, nothing's new. Anyhow, I talk too much. I'm sorry.
Just a follow-up question, because this is interesting what you said about the polls. But one of the things I thought about when you showed the image of the Lady Liberty who was stabbed to death by some wild type of guy with a knife.
Brian, that was an Italian. That's a stereotype of an Italian immigrant. That costume that he's wearing, isn't that funny? Yeah. So in the 1890s, there was a lot of immigration to America, and that was from a magazine for rich white people, and magazines like that love to make fun of immigrants and farmers and every other group you might imagine. And so they've made Brian as an Italian immigrant who has stabbed Lady Liberty. It's the craziest. I mean, it's crazy.
No, I understand. But if you look at that image, I'm sure some people will look at that image and they think about, for example, the storming of the Capitol. Of like some horde of angry people who are storming one of the institutions of democracy,
yes.
and that's what's triggering such a poll. So how did you?
Here, let's put it up again.
How did you look at that event? Yeah,
the Capitol.
Yeah, and I'm not saying at all that you should equate those people with just like a large group of common voters, but I'm sure this is what's driving the divide, isn't it?
I think you're right about that. There's and the other cartoon, what's this one? It's Riot. This is an image of Riot. Now it's, and the riot is scary, and here come the police to put the riot down. And there's William Jennings Bryan. By the way, the red flag behind him does not say revolution. It says repudiation. Isn't that funny? But this is a magazine for very affluent people, and this is their understanding of what Bryan represented. Now, Bryan never did anything like that. Bryan was a totally harmless man. He was I don't know if you know the story of William Jennings Bryan. He was a fundamentalist Christian who was a pacifist and actually was in the government during World War I, and left the government, refused to be in the government because he wouldn't have anything to do with World War I, with the First World War. He was that kind of guy. He would never lead a riot. Now, the Capitol riot, that was very disturbing. That really bothered me, but that's not populism. It captures a kind of deep fear that's in the back of everyone's minds, but that's something else. That's riot, that's anarchy, that's maybe an attempted coup. There's lots of words for that, but it's not populism. It's also, did you see that the rioters are you shouldn't have got me started on this because I'll talk forever, and I have to apologize to you, Coen, because I talk too much. It's a real problem. But
I'll stop you in a bit for the next question. But
the rioters,
please go on.
The rioters were not working class people. I mean, we learn more about them all the time. They tended to be a lot of them were small business owners. It's actually really interesting. Small business owners, a lot of whom had their livelihood had been disrupted by the COVID pandemic. And a lot of them were very familiar to me because 10 years ago, I used to go to these Tea Party protests. Are you familiar with this movement in America? It was a right-wing movement. And
most people are, yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, you're in a foreign country. What do I know? I mean, anyhow, I used to go write about these people. This was one of my things. I would go to their protests and I would interview people and I would take notes and that sort of thing. And it was a lot of the same kind of individuals. And it really shocked me and surprised me that they were willing to break into the Capitol building and vandalize the seat of government in America. That was astonishing to me. We've clearly turned a corner here in the United States.
We have another question from Raquel, and she's in the Zoom, so she should be able to ask it herself. But I'm a bit scared to make any
I am.
projections.
I'm here.
Yeah, there she is. Hi, Raquel. Please ask your question.
Yeah, well, I had a couple of questions, but I think the most relevant one is that there are some studies that indicate that higher educated people are actually amongst the most prejudiced groups in society against lower educated poor people. So that's a fact. But the question is, do you have ideas on how do we turn it around?
That's exactly what I'm describing here. It is a form of prejudice. Another thing that they believe, they believe all sorts of things about poorly educated people. Among other things, they attribute racist sentiment to poorly educated whites. They exaggerate it. Statistically, we know that it's not, that they believe things about lower educated groups that are just not true. Obviously there's a lot of racism in America, but there's a lot of racism in the upper classes as well. That's one of the sort of themes of this book, which I didn't get time to talk about today, but in the 1890s, obviously racism was, a really important part of American life, sort of race hatred. And it was used against populism. It was used to destroy the working class movement of the day. And what was the second part of your question?
What should we do about it?
What should we do about it? There's always these difficult questions. Well, here's the thing. Remember when I said this sort of the utopia of scolding? I am one of these sort of well-educated, affluent white collar people. I am that, and I live in an area around these people, and I grew up with those people, and that really is my group. And one of the things that I am impressed by is that they are, well, you can't persuade them of certain basic things. Like, for example, one of the arguments that I made in Listen Liberal is that elites, that a lot of ordinary Americans are right when they say that elites get things wrong and that elites are screwing things up and that experts are making mistakes. That is correct. You can go down the list from the Iraq War, which was a disaster, the global financial crisis, which was masterminded by these people on Wall Street, who all had advanced degrees, who were then bailed out by, their classmates in the Obama administration. You go right down the list. It's just one incredible screw up after another. And so ordinary people are right to look at our sort of ruling class in America and say, wow, you guys are terrible at ruling. You're really bad at this game. And I made that argument, I think, in a very convincing way in Listen Liberal. And you might recall, I actually came to the Netherlands and talked about it in the Netherlands. And I went to France. The book was translated into French. I've talked about it all over the world. The one country where they don't want to hear that message? Right here. Right here. When I wrote that, I instantly became... I used to be on TV and radio in America all the time. I had a newspaper column. And now I'm just... that argument is absolutely unacceptable in this country. It is extremely difficult to persuade the American white collar elite that there's something wrong with the way they view the world. In fact, they would rather believe the most incredible falsehoods than believe that they as a class are in the grip of some pathology or other. Okay. What am I referring to? It's called Russiagate. Do you know about this? So Trump beats Hillary. It's a huge shock. The polling companies got it wrong. Hillary's people got it wrong. There's this incredible upset. Nobody saw it coming. And instead of the Democratic Party saying, wow, what have we done wrong? Instead, they said, aha, this must be because a hostile foreign power meddled in our election. And they developed this to such a point where they were saying that Donald Trump was probably some kind of Soviet spy or an agent. You know what I'm talking about? This is called Russiagate, that he had colluded with the Russians. And there were all of these different elements of it. And it all fell apart. It turned out to not be true. The Russians did buy ads on Facebook. That part of it is true. And the Russians wanted Trump to win. That is true. but Trump himself apparently didn't have anything to do with it. There were all of these incredible aspects of the story that all turned out to be wrong. But among this group that I'm describing, they still believe that stuff. It doesn't matter if you disprove it, they still believe it, because they would rather believe in something like that than do an autopsy, than figure out what they did wrong. And that's quite incredible. And it's frustrating indeed. I'm sorry, Raquel, and that's far more of an answer than you bargained for. I'm so sorry. I just blab. We should let somebody else get a question.
We got two YouTube questions, so I'm gonna ask them to you because they can't do it from YouTube. One is from Tobias van der Wal, who asks, how do you evaluate the rise of anti-populism during the Obama years, since Obama at one point tried to rehabilitate the word populism?
Yes, he did. That's amazing that Tobias knows that. Yes. Obama. So it's very rare for American politicians to refer to themselves as populist. It's pretty rare. So Ronald Reagan, well, Jimmy Carter did it. In the 1970s, there was this vogue for the word. The word came back in style. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
There's some static on the line. Jimmy Carter referred to himself as a populist, but what he meant by that was that he was a nice guy, you know? And then Ronald Reagan didn't refer to himself as a populist, but his advisors did. And they tried to depict Reagan as a man of the people. And then they did the same with George Bush Sr. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this. He had this incredible campaign where he would eat pork rinds and he traveled around the country with country and Western singers and all this nonsense. And so people used to, it wasn't yet a bad word for a long time. And Obama did refer to himself as a populist on at least one occasion that I've been able to find. But then when Trump started showing up, the journalistic elites in America and the political science group, they needed a word to refer to Trumpism, and they settled on populism. They plucked this old definition out of Hofstadter, and they started using it to refer to Trump. And by the end of his time in office, Obama was using that definition. Obama had gone over to that, and that's now standard. You see that everywhere in America.
All right. The second question that is a bit related, perhaps, is from Jeroen Bouterse, also on YouTube. Is it possible to criticize populism, or what we today see as populism, without that criticism being an attack on ordinary people? Or does an attack on populism always rely on a faulty analysis of what is wrong about, for example, Trumpism?
Well, I do that all the time. I criticize Trump all the time. He's the easiest guy to criticize in the world, and but at the same time, I have family members that voted for him, and I know that they're good people, and I know that they want the best for this country. And so I actually know people that voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. I know people that voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary and then voted for Trump. And so for me, it's easy to do to say Trump is a terrible president. He's gone now, and I'm very relieved that Trump was a dreadful president. But a lot of people voted for him, that didn't do it out of malevolence. There were people who voted for him in the sort of ordinary way that Americans vote for presidential candidates. Look, politics, you and I, Coen, we do politics every day. We think about it every day. Most Americans do not. They're worried about their business or their family or whatever it is, their job, and they vote once every 4 years. And they assume that the two political parties are like two big corporations, that the products that they are putting out are going to be safe. Ford wouldn't sell you, or General Motors would not sell you a car that's going to explode, right? So they assume that that because Trump has the seal of approval of one of the two big parties, that he's okay. And this is really a reasonable assumption. But you can't just hold all these people responsible, in my opinion. And it's one of my things is I dislike a lot of our politicians here in America, but I like America and I like Americans. I think we're good people. So that's my answer.
All right, great. We have a question from Zoom again, and it's from Kees about the culture war. Kees, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
We can.
You base yourself in your original definition of populism very much on the socio-economic side, on the poor against the rich, on the common people against the elite. But a very important element that we face nowadays is the social side of it. Let's say of the people, the common people who feel lost in modern society, who suffer from creative destruction and that kind of thing. And so people who have feeling that Muslims shouldn't be here or that immigrants shouldn't be here, that kind of thing very much marks populism, at least in the Netherlands.
Yes. Is it over to me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thomas, please.
Yes, and we of course have that sentiment in America as well, but I don't think it's as strong here because America is a country of immigrants, ultimately, and we understand that. That's Trump's, what was it, his grandfather that came to America from Germany, and my great grandfather came to America from a place called Württemberg. I don't know where that is, but in the 1850s. Anyhow, so years ago, I wrote a book about the culture wars called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And the idea was that lots of working class people who would ordinarily, in other times, would be part of a left party, that these people had been drawn way to the right by culture war issues. Now, I wasn't at the time, this is in the this is 15 years ago. I wasn't thinking about immigration. That was not a big issue at the time. But there are many other culture war issues. For example, abortion is a huge issue here in America. Guns, gun control. What should we do about, should everybody have the right to buy a machine gun? That's a huge issue in America. This was in my home state of Kansas, we were debating the theory of evolution, which is kind of crazy and it's hard to believe, but it really happened. And then there are many, many others. And what I eventually decided, when you look at all of these issues, and I would interview the leaders of these movements, and I would talk to, people that were really into the culture war issues, was that all of them, and this is really interesting, all of them were, and I'm sorry, this is, by the way, I just realized I'm not going to provide a good answer for your question. I'm going to answer what it means here in America, the culture wars mean here in America. All of the culture war issues in America are phrased as class war by other means. So they would say, well, it's you against the Hollywood elites. The Hollywood elites want to fiddle with your culture, and they don't, and you don't get to have a say in it. Or the science professors at the university want to tell you about, the theory of evolution, and your kids are in public schools and you don't get to have a say in it. It's always about the elites running your world and you having no power. And so it's the way I described it is it's like culture, it's like class war with the economics drained out of it. And so my argument then, and it's the same argument I make today, and you can, by the way, this to me is what explains the great right turn. You have from Ronald Reagan right up to Donald Trump, these right-wing politicians who describe themselves as friends of the common man, friends of the working class. Ronald Reagan, would he had been a union leader. He's the only American president that's ever been a union leader. Donald Trump, we all know what he did, but it's the same thing. And it's a ridiculous claim. It's a ridiculous claim because they get into office and what do? They cut taxes, they deregulate polluters, they make it easier to pollute, they make the billionaires even richer than ever before, and they don't do anything about the culture wars. They don't care about that. I mean, Trump doesn't really give a damn about building his stupid wall or whatever, whatever it was that he was promising. He didn't do any of those things. And Reagan didn't really care about ordinary Americans. Their lives were destroyed. And so my argument then and my argument today is that the way to beat these people is by focusing very, very closely on the economic issues and on the issues of how we distribute wealth, who has power, who doesn't. And I'm happy to see that Joe Biden is doing some of that. But then again, I thought Barack Obama was going to do that and he didn't do it. And they keep losing and they keep losing and they keep losing. Now that might not apply in the Netherlands. And I'm not an expert on the politics of the Netherlands, and I can't give you a good answer on that. Can I tell you what the original populists did? This is actually, you might find this interesting. They were not a particularly anti-immigrant party. That was not their thing. A lot of them were immigrants because this is in a period of high immigration. A place like Kansas was filled with immigrants from Germany, Ireland, the UK, and from the Netherlands, all over that part of the world. And those people were populists. They voted for the populist party. What the populists did, though, they did have culture wars in those days. The main culture war was called prohibition. Are you familiar with this? We banned liquor in America. We made liquor illegal. And this was being debated all over America in the 1890s. And the way the populists dealt with that was by never talking about it. They just ignored it. They refused to ever say a word about it because it divided their base. German immigrants hated prohibition because they liked beer. But women who could vote in some of these states, women were in favor of prohibition, and populists wanted to reach out to them. And so they were torn. And so their answer was never talk about it, ever. It's not a great answer, but that's what they did.
All right. Thomas, thank you very much. We have a few questions concerning things like strategy, and you already mentioned a bit about focusing on economic and power issues. What to turn the tide. So I'll just grab some of these questions into one big question.
Wait, one more thing I want to add to that. In some ways, Joe Biden was exactly the right guy to do that, because he is himself kind of he does this working class act. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but he likes to tour factories. He likes to speak in union halls. He refers to himself as middle class Joe. Middle class is a euphemism for working class here in America. He always talks about his hard scrabble childhood, this kind of thing. And in some ways, he is the perfect guy to go up against Donald Trump. Had it been someone like Pete Buttigieg, who is this, very much the sort of managerial Hillary Clinton type, things might have worked out differently. But Biden was in some ways exactly what we needed. Okay, sorry about that. I interrupted you.
No problem at all.
And Michael Passerini still has his hand up.
Yeah, but we do questions in the Zoom, so perhaps he already.
Okay.
Well, one big last question in which some other questions that are posed throughout the evening are blended in. But what should the question is twofold, perhaps. Some people, especially in the Netherlands, are saying, well, you have like 20% of the vote that goes to right-wing, populist, extremist, whatever name you would like to use for them. And well, 80% of the voters are not voting for them. So should we really care that much? That's the first question. But if we decide to care, then what should be the political agenda and the top priorities be for, you know, a party like D66, but there are many other parties, of course, in other countries who are, you know, progressive liberal parties. And what would your best piece of advice be for them?
Come on now, you know I don't comment on Dutch politics.
Well, progressive politics.
Is that right that these right-wing parties are only 20% of the vote?
The right-wing populist bloc of Geert Wilders, Baudet, and some smaller parties who just got elected into parliament is like 20% of the vote. But then you got, for example, a left-wing socialist party, and you got some other protest parties like the Animals Party, etc.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't, you know, if they're 20% of the vote, no, I'm not that concerned about them. That's a funny thing for me to say because my opinions are extremely unpopular in America. If I ran, if I actually had a candidate that I liked, they'd probably get about that percentage, you know, maybe 15%, you know. But yeah, 20%, that's not that impressive. That would be a wipeout in America. 20%, man, you wouldn't get anywhere with that.
Yeah, I have to stress we got 17 political parties in parliament right now.
Okay. Well, come on now. You're asking me questions that are tough because I don't really understand. I don't have a lot of advice for a system like that because I think in terms of a two-party system. By the way, incidentally, populism was the last time we had a functioning third party in the system. And after they died, we changed the system so it would never happen again. The two main parties changed the system so that it would never happen again. And as a result, we only have two parties in this country, and we don't have to worry about stuff like that. I say that, but then we just elected Trump.
Yeah.
Okay. You can see I don't have a good answer for you, but I'll tell you something funny. I'll make a joke. Okay. I don't have a good answer for you, so I'll make a joke, which is that I remember when Trump first emerged as the Republican nominee, the first thing I thought of, I didn't know anything about him. I hadn't been thinking about him. I wasn't paying attention to the election. And one of my kids told me Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee. And I was like, no way. The guy with the hair, you know, because he has that extreme hairdo. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's actually from the Netherlands. And we were talking about all these right-wing politicians over the years. And we noticed that they all have these flamboyant hairdos. Right? Ronald Reagan. Think of that incredible hairdo of Ronald Reagan. Think of Margaret Thatcher, your own Geert Wilders. Who's the guy in Italy? He has the most extraordinary hair. And there's a kind of of course, Boris Johnson. There's a kind of a vanity with these people that's really telling. That's fascinating to me. But that's my joke. So it's all about the hair. My whole theory about them has to do with the hair.
All right, let's end tonight with the hairdos then. Dear Thomas, I would like to thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I'm sure it is food for thought for everyone, both inside and outside D66, for the future, for everyone who's tuned in. And I also hope we can talk again in the future, because it was not only interesting, it was also fun to listen to, and I think I speak for all of the attendees. So thank you very much.
The pleasure was all mine.
Great. I would also like to thank the people making this event possible, who did lots of the preparation and lots of the practical side, like Martin, Jan Julius, Bo, and Bouke, both from D66 and the Van Mierlo Foundation here in the studio. They're waving at me right now. And of course, thanks to you for tuning in. If you like these events, make sure you go to vanmierlostichting.nl and subscribe to our newsletter. Take a subscription to Idea Magazine and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and all those other big tech companies that we should break up as soon as possible. Thank you very much, and please enjoy your evening and stay safe.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.